My listeners are in for a real treat in this episode. I met Tracy Pepe at a Bond event, which is a networking event for architects and designers where Tracy was a keynote speaker. Now, I had read Tracy's bio and subject matter in the program and was still unprepared for what I was about to learn. As architects and designers, we tend to gravitate to designing to the expected senses, such as sight and feel and sound. But Tracy opened my eyes, well, nose, to another sense they had not really considered. So, Tracy, welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you.
Yeah.
So those who don't know you, please tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background, which is really fascinating.
Yeah. So my name is Tracy. I'm from Canada. I live just outside of Toronto. So in comparison, we don't have a fragrance manufacturing industry here like you do in the United States, where you have a massive industry. And so there came a time early in my school that if I wanted to really do training, I had to go into Germany, in which I developed how to become a professional perfumer. And it is about formulation. It is about understanding the raw materials and how the raw materials work, as well as how to learn how to smell, to be honest with you. And my training then took me on a really interesting journey where I began scenting properties or spaces, and I became one of the only ones in Canada to do that. So I kind of set out a really niche market, but I was early in my career, and my son, he's older at 31 now, but he was diagnosed at 4 with ADD, ADHD, a lot of learning disabilities. And back then he wouldn't have been on the spectrum, but now he would be classified on the spectrum. And I knew if I didn't kind of figure out something, how to connect with him. And so anyway, both journeys ran side by side. I was a young mother in an industry, and I was trying to work out a very niche market. Anyway, the research and the focus on how scent impacts the brain really is where the story started.
Fascinating. And so let's dive into it. Having taken care of my mother for a long time, who I think when we were at the Bond event, I told you she had severe short-term memory loss. The one thing during sort of her progression that I knew sparked really strong memories for her was music. But the work that you're doing with smell is going much farther with a lot more impressive results. Can you describe for the listeners the work you're doing with Alzheimer's patients, which I'm finding fascinating, and talk about some of the results you're getting?
Sure. So what I've done is I've created a company called Smelling Pink, and we work in the long-term care facilities. We specialize really similar to music, using scent as a tool to influence the brain or to impact the brain, because we know the brain has a section called the limbic system, which is part of the old brain. And what that means is specifically Alzheimer's and dementia, that they start to lose day-to-day functionings. Memory loss is more about the last 30 days, the last 10 days, the last 10 minutes, where the limbic system is tied to old memories of back when, maybe a senior was 20. They can remember that story, but they can't remember who you are in the presence. And what's really fascinating is the limbic system is connected to emotion. And smell triggers the limbic system. It triggers the physiology within the body. It can release hormones on various different levels to either relax or to stimulate the brain. And so Smelling Pink was launched a few years ago, mainly after COVID, how to create or deal with isolation, but also how to deal with the issues that a lot of families and these facilities are facing, where you can't really connect to people. And I'll give the listeners an example. This is so they can kind of put this in perspective. We don't scent the space. This is not aromatherapy. We don't apply anything to the individual. We are literally taking raw materials or smells, scents, plant materials that we know have been researched to stimulate the brain. And so I had a senior gentleman who has Parkinson's. And one of the early diagnostics with Parkinson's is you lose your sense of smell. That's way before the disease is prevalent. And when we started passing around smells, rosemary, essential oil, rosemary has been known to really stimulate the brain in Parkinson's individuals. And it was fascinating because when we passed the scent and he was smelling it, all of a sudden his eyes lit up. He could speak. All of a sudden his memory turned on. And that really had a huge impact on him because he hadn't smelled in probably 10 years anything. And when you lose, and I'm sure there's listeners who have had COVID and lost their sense of smell and taste, it is really profound. But then the brain turns on, which then fires up memories, and it's not a cure by any means. And I don't want people to understand that. But what it does is it improves the quality and the connection. And as you know, Scott, when you're trying to have a conversation with someone who has Alzheimer's, you are really trying to do everything you possibly can to connect and have some type of emotional connection with them.
Right. And you mentioned COVID. Interestingly, a lot of people I know, even a couple of my kids who got COVID during that pandemic, they almost seemed more concerned that they lost their smell than if they were going to get sick.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that was one of the main reasons my entire industry or my business completely pivoted 3 years ago. I used to work with architects. I used to do a lot of work in the interior design world, but I was terrified, absolutely terrified. I communicate through my sense of smell and my taste. I couldn't imagine losing it. I was actually quite fearful. I dove into the research. And one of the things COVID did is it literally opened up a vault of about 5 decades worth of scent research on how smell impacts and influences the brain. But I do understand that because the depression rate skyrockets when you lose your sense of smell. Like you are more likely to be depressed. I think it's like an 82%. Like it's really high when you lose your sense of smell. And listeners can try a really interesting tool to understand what that's like. If you plug your nose and your ear and you chew something, and you do not allow the oxygen to get in. And Scott, I think we did this at the Bond event with the jelly beans. What happens is it shows people it's almost bleak. And then as soon as you open up the orifice and the oxygen comes in, what ends up happening is you get the flavors. And this is what happens in COVID is people couldn't smell coffee or taste coffee to your kid's point, it is pretty devastating because it does impact how you feel and how you respond every day, and not being able to enjoy your food or the smell of your partner or washing your kid and not being able to smell their hair. There's a huge connection because the emotional connection affiliated with scent and how we feel is always underestimated. And what happened with COVID is it brought it to everyone's attention.
Right. And again, having gone through that at your seminar, that was really amazing.
Oh, with the jelly beans. Yeah, I recommend everyone try it. And so the listeners can follow along as you basically take some jelly beans because they are sugared, high fructose, and you put a few in your mouth and you plug your nose and your ears at the same time and you chew. And you will then start to understand what it's like for a lot of seniors who lose their sense of smell and taste, but also what happened with COVID. And then when you released and let the air flow in, all of a sudden you get these amazing flavors. And there's a black and white experience that really happens. And I think that's part of this process is starting to really understand when people have dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, various different cognitive aspects of the brain, what are they experiencing and how are they feeling?
Right. I mean, scent can be such a huge trigger. I know for me, especially as we're getting into the Christmas holiday season, some of my favorite memories were the smell and the aromas of my grandparents' house, having Christmas dinner there. And when I prepare a Christmas dinner here for our family, it always reminds me of her in the kitchen, which is great memories for me. So it is a huge trigger. For you, I guess, what is your experience as far as certain scents and certain triggers for people? And how do we use those scents as we perceive the environments we're in?
Yeah, so they're great questions because basically there's a lot of research, first of all, because I'm very research driven where I don't, the reason why there's a difference with aromatherapy is aromatherapy, I'll just define for many of the viewers or the listeners, is I use plant extracts. So first and foremost, the reason I use plant extracts is when I wrote my book, I got into when you lost your sense of smell. So that was part of my fear with COVID. I had this idea that everybody should be able to use raw materials that they could have access to. And so those raw materials became herbs, teas, and essential oils. Now, most people in the United States and Canada, all over the world, know what an essential oil is. You can buy it at any grocery store or health food store. And they are basically, in the world of perfumery, they are aromatic chemicals. And so the research has been going on for years. What does rosemary essential oil do? What does vetiver? What does lavender do? There's some common essential oils, and scientists, researchers, Yale, Harvard, very different organizations, universities around the world have been studying this. And so what I did is I took all the research, or as much as I could, and I started to look at it and break it into stimulating and relaxing. So for example, there's a group of smells that we talk about that are very low vibration, that are base notes. Vetiver. Vetiver is a good example. It's like patchouli. It is, I'll describe it, and this is where olfactive language is interesting because you may not know what the smells like, but it has a smoky smell. It's got a woody scent to it. It's almost musky. It's almost like if you picked up driftwood and you tried to smell what does driftwood smell like. It has this really interesting aroma. The research shows that it helps individuals with ADD and ADHD. So what does it do? Is it triggers the serotonin in your brain. Well, if you've ever been around a child or an individual who has ADD, ADHD, the brain gets stuck sometimes and they get triggered. And so what happens is they get over and over and over and over and over. It's like the record keeps going around and round. And what scent does is it allows the brain, in some cases, not for all, but in some cases with children, if you smell it, it causes the brain to release the serotonin to trigger. And so back to my story with my son, he has so many incredible thoughts, ideas, beliefs, like it's fantastic listening to him. But try to get it on a piece of paper and hand it in for a report. Oy, 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 that was, the teacher's nightmare. So I used to use vetiver, and I used to put it on a cotton ball for him. And I tell him, this is your superpower. And when you're in school and you're trying to get that stuff out, give it a smell and then allow the scent. Just do what your brain says and write down what your brain says. And he learned at a very early age how to use scent as a tool. And that is something that I think our society is missing. It is a tool. Some of these oils, like I spoke about Parkinson's, rosemary is a stimulant. So if you smell rosemary, it turns on the synapses in the brain and it fires it up. Well, that's like doing a jigsaw puzzle, right? Like there's certain brain activities that we all know we can do to stimulate the brain. So this is how these raw materials work as a tool. Lavender is a really good example of the research of insomnia, where people who have difficulty sleeping, I think it's at a 46% increase of REM sleep. Now that's pretty high. And considering we live in a society where we're sleep deprived, everybody should take 2 or 3 drops of lavender and put it on a tissue in their bed. Like there's some really interesting research coming out of these scented pillows that are infused with lavender to help address dealing with insomnia. And the reason is the smell actually causes the brain to trigger. And in that case, it's a relaxant. It's calming. It has a soothing impact on the nervous system. So this is the research that I just find absolutely fascinating. And there's a lot of it. And if the listeners want to explore the research, which I always recommend, on LinkedIn, there is a group called the Olfactive Group, and I run it. And we have probably 5,500 different researchers who put their papers up, and we share information, because that was also one of the things that came forward, I think, in COVID, is now people want to just share the information, and they want people to understand how to use it.
Great. I think one of the keynotes you said was in your last comments, sleep deprivation. And I think no people are more sleep deprived than architects, designers, and engineers, which leads me to my next question. As I started sort of the podcast out, the site, the texture, those are all things that, we learn in architecture school and design school, but smell is not. Given that, what advice would you give to architects, interior designers, and even engineers? What are we missing?
Yeah, and that is one of the best questions. And the reason it is, for so many reasons, because it opens up, the idea, what are you missing? You're missing this element of vibration. And I know architects in the design industry understand vibration. And Luca Turin is a researcher in the olfactive science, and he discovered years and years ago that smell is actually a vibration. And that's really fascinating to me, because how it impacts the brain. However, when you're working in a space and you are very cognitive and thought process is very clear when it comes to color, when it comes to sound, whether you have white noise or not, whether you are ceiling heights, your lighting, all these external aspects to the design create the space. You never ask the question, what will the space smell like when it's finished? And if we are designing a hospital, for example, in 6 months, what will be here? What will be the aromas or the smells? Because scent changes a space. And this is a question that I wish the architecture industry in general, the design industry, would really contemplate, because it may cause you to choose different raw materials. And for example, I'll put it into perspective. I worked with the redesign of a very luxury hotel, and they were building the spa, the pool, and they were very, very aware of the smell of chlorine entering off of the elevator. They didn't want that, because it has a very, it has a strong scent to it. It can be very overpowering in certain situations. And so they actually designed the space with that in mind. It's not necessarily adding a smell. It's actually just being completely aware of the level, the smell, the aromas, the flow, the airflow, the HVAC. All these components now became a better conversation, which created a different design, because it helped with the overall impact of what they were trying to achieve. And I think that is a question that I would really ask your industry in general to ask more of each other in the areas of the finishings, the space, the consumer component to it, as well as, I think, from the impact, because part of my work is obviously I really have a dedication to emotional, but also our mental health. And scent is an incredible tool to help with our mental health.
Totally agree. And the timing is really good, because I'm coming off a series of workplace design. And in design school, I happen to take color psychology classes, where they basically teach you the psychology of color and how certain colors can make people feel a certain way. I think it dovetails especially into what you're doing, where the scent plays a part in how people are feeling. In your studies and research, have you found that certain scents or triggers have shown to increase, say, employee productivity or mental health, say, in the corporate office?
Yeah, actually, how I got into this industry long time ago, IBI Canada, there was an architect who approached me for McDonald's head office, actually. They they were groundbreaking at the time because this was at least 20 years ago. They were creating an open concept environment for McDonald's head office here. And the idea, they came across research on certain smells and how it impacts the productivity within a work environment. And there were some studies coming out of Japan. And the question became, Tracy, would you be willing to consider this? This was one of my first corporate projects. And this is where I really dove into how scent. And one of the stories that come out of that is the majority of the citrus smells, a lot of the citrus smells. So things like mandarin, grapefruit, orange, tangerine, lime, lemon. These are what industry reference would be kind of like a happy smell, right? They have a deodorizing component to them chemically as well. That's one of the reasons why they're used in a lot of cleaning products. That's why you would use them in detergents, in laundry soaps, because there is a deodorizing aspect. So when you have a community space within a corporation and you have a lot of food or people bringing their lunches, or you have this, you will create the offset of the odor. And this is where I really loved the architect at the time, because he was asking the question, well, we're going to create this community lunchroom and we're going to have everybody sit there. And isn't this wonderful? And you can bring your lunch or use the cafeteria. But then what is it going to smell like after you have 30 people from different cultures bringing in different foods? Like, can we all go there? We can, and we can imagine what that would smell like. And so after everyone leaves and goes back to their desk, what is the aroma? So that's where the design principles came in. Now, they used a lot of really good filter systems, but we did infuse a scent within that area that had citrus notes to it. And that scent was then when you got off the elevators, and it was based on the premise of stimulation, productivity, but it also was using the materials because we had this idea, or we had some indication about the odor that was going to potentially happen. So it's interesting because it plays into this whole idea of how scent works within a design space and how it impacts us. The other area, which is really fascinating to me, is children, Montessori schools in particularly. They know that scent is a stimulant and it can be used as a tool, just, going back to my son and my experience with my son, of training the brain. And how many of us in college or university are going after those long nights and Red Bulls and tons of, stimulants? Well, scent is a trigger. You can actually train your brain to study and use these stimulants while you're studying your test, go into the class and smell it. It just helps to re-trigger your brain. It's a learning technique. And I think there's a lot of these tools that our society really hasn't explored.
No, that's great. And I love, Tracy, how you reference the scent as a tool. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, because I think one of the biggest problems that I come across is, well, two issues. First, people will say, what about scent-free policies? And scent-free policies are only there for HR's purposes. They don't exist. On an average day, you smell 10,000 different aromas. Your clothes are washed in detergents and fabric softeners. You have VOCs within carpets, and we live in an aroma world. It's a threshold, as you can imagine. It's no different than music, right? It becomes a threshold. If you get into a small space and you're in an elevator and someone has a perfume on, then of course that threshold gets hit. The sensitivities are really interesting because I feel North America, and it's my personal feeling, there's no proof on this, but there is a lot of proof that there is no connection with a scent molecule and multiple chemical sensitivities. Like, it is a trigger, and we understand that it triggers headaches and it can trigger symptoms, but scent-free policies actually don't really work. They only work for a political framework. So these are things that we kind of have to start addressing, because in our society, what's happened with COVID, and this is where we are with Smelling Pink, is we had all these retirement communities and all these facilities had scent-free policies. Well, We've been to long-term care facilities. They don't have pleasant odors. And they don't have pleasant odors because aging has a different odor than children, right? There's the skin changes, the body functions change. They're in small spaces. It's usually warmer, and there's a different odor there. Then we threw masks on, and then those masks caused us to eliminate almost everything, positive and negative, but we were only smelling our breath. This now compounds a lot of issues. And so we are now kind of going in an opposite direction where scent-free policies are going out the window. I see a huge trend happening more and more. And the discussion is, well, now how can we use scent effectively? Because it is a tool. It's not necessarily wearing your best cologne to work, because I don't agree with that. It's a very personal thing. It's something for your partner and yourself and your personal space. And the work environment is a public space. However, there are scent that you could use to help stimulate you instead of having the third cup of coffee, and help to calm you down if you're really intense, because it's been an incredibly intense work day. There's different ways. And so I think tools, I love using the word tools because our society thinks smell generally is about perfume, which it's not. The industry is massive and it's used in all areas. But the one area, because of, the Kardashians, and she has a line of fragrance, that we just automatically assume it's a perfume.
Please tell the listeners about your book, Why the Nose, and what I guess you'd like the reader to walk away with after reading.
Yeah, so I wrote Why the Nose, as I said, during COVID. I started to realize millions of people around the world were losing their sense of smell, and that scared me. And if you go to a doctor to this day and you've had lost your sense of smell or you still haven't got it back, they don't classify that a serious medical issue because it's not in their wheelhouse, okay? And the problem with that is your quality of life will have diminished greatly, depending. Now, if I ask your listeners, how well do you smell something? How well do you taste something? Most of them haven't done the jelly bean test like you did, Scott, in the keynote, but you also didn't smell some of the raw materials to know, can I actually smell this? So I really wanted people to read the book to understand why it is so important to smell. That is the first thing. But the other thing is I wanted to teach you that you can get your sense of smell and your sense of taste back. It's a training. It's like physiotherapy to the brain. And I really thought about, well, what happens if you lived in New Delhi and you didn't have access to a lot of the raw materials that we have in North America? But a lot of raw materials are in India and China. They come from all different parts of the world. So would this be the same impact? And so that's where the essential oils came in. I also wanted to teach people about plants and herbs, because a lot of these natural smells come from fantastic plants. And so what do you do with them? And the idea really transformed for me because I was away giving a keynote. I was in Dubai. I was presenting and I was working on smell. And I really started to see it from a different perspective, because different cultures use or have a translation to scent much different than we do here in North America. And so I wanted people to start to understand we really need to start focusing on how we smell something and why. Why should we do it? Why is this so important?
Well, that's great feedback. And can you tell, and for the listeners, I'm going to put all of Tracy's links in the advertisement for this episode, but where can the listeners get your book?
So my book is an ebook. It's like $2.95. The objective was to give as much information as I possibly could. It started actually when I was doing my TED Talk, and I'll put that link in the bottom because that's kind of the story of my superpower, how I even got into essential oils and why it's so relevant with my son. And I have a sister who is in CAMH in Canada. If people don't know what CAMH is, it's one of our mental health facilities. My sister has schizophrenia and she has bipolar. And so I've been around mental health all my life and I am an advocate for it. And by no means am I suggesting that scent cures any of this, but it certainly does help with anxiety. It helps with depression. It helps as another tool, and I'm back to the tool in the toolbox of how can we help. And when, I know, Scott, you have children, and when you have little kids, you're a little more inclined not to want to put them on heavy psychosis medications at first. You really want to do whatever you can to look at various different aspects. I don't think our society is looking at scent enough. And I don't think we're really paying attention to it. So I wanted people to read the book and to kind of go, that's interesting, and challenge me. I really encourage all the listeners to challenge me, to go look at the research and to see what you discover. And at the end of the day, if you're in the car and you're in traffic and someone is having a panic attack, and you happen to have bergamot oil, for example, which is fantastic for anxiety, and you had it on a cotton ball and you stuck it in the air vent and you just did some deep breathing, what if it worked? Wouldn't that be fun? And if it didn't work, it's okay too. This is something where we need more tools in the toolbox, because we know with anxiety and panic attacks, they get worse if you don't address them. If you don't start to work with them, the next panic attack gets stronger and stronger, to the point where you think you're having a heart attack for some people, and they end up in the hospital. This is what I'm trying to get people to understand, that if we have this beautiful nose that is on our face, and we can smell certain things based on the research and the science to help us, and it can guide us in a way to take some just to help us along the journey, and add another tool like diet, like meditation, like exercise, like all the wonderful things we know about. This just now becomes part of our personal wellness repertoire.
No, thank you for that. And Tracy, your knowledge is, from what I've learned getting to know you for the last, what has it been, like 6 months?
Yes.
Something like that?
Yeah.
Your knowledge in your book, your research is for everybody. It's for somebody that may be dealing with somebody with mental challenges or Alzheimer's. If you have like college students out there, should get to know your information. It's literally for everybody.
Well, if we think about this, and this is an interesting statistic, prior to COVID, 1 in 4 people would be dealing with mental health issues with someone in their family. So that is anything on the spectrum, from mental health of ADD to depression, anxiety, to insomnia, to any form. Now it's 2 in 4. So that's 50% of the public is facing that. And it increases when we get into certain time frames. Like right now, we're moving in, Scott and I are in the northern hemisphere. The lights get less or more darkness. This is a huge impact. I'd like to tell listeners, depending on when they're listening to this, January 15th is Blue Monday. It's the saddest day of the year in the northern hemisphere. Suicide rates go up. Least amount of light in the North American hemisphere, specifically within our area of Toronto and New York State. And so we do a webinar on that day, and we teach people how to use scent. And I like to start with a cup of tea, because everybody's got a cup of tea. During COVID, when we were in the lockdowns, I opened up the pantry. How I got into this when I was a kid actually is a fun story, because this is a takeaway for all of the listeners who have children. The scent game. It's something that I believe in wholeheartedly. It's something that we've incorporated with seniors, is you take the smells and you go into your kitchen and you take some sardines, or hypothetically, or anchovies, or whatever you want, and you put some peanut butter in it, and you throw these really god-awful smells together. And that's where kids think this is fun. And you mix it up, and then you put a blindfold and you smell it, and you see if you can pull the notes out. And you can see if you can actually smell certain smells. And kids really like this, because it's very tactile. And when children identify with smell at an early age, because that's how they nurse, that's how they know their mother, that's how they are instinctively connected. And so as they get older, smell is fun, because if you sit at the table and you say, well, how does that smell? They usually say yucky. That's yucky or that's yummy. It's usually one of two things, which is how it ends where we're at in the seniors world. It's usually positive or it's not happy. It's, it's that simple. And what do we do as adults? We generally complicate everything.
Of course.
So I love the scent game because it becomes that simple. And you can play it anywhere on vacation. You can do it. You don't need any electronics. And you can just close your eyes, blindfold yourself, and guess and see if you can smell something. And when my sister was growing up, she's much older than me, her diagnosis wasn't clear until she was later in her 20s. But it was the one game her and I just absolutely loved. And we would try and we would do all kinds of crazy stuff. And lo and behold, I became the perfumer. And it's interesting. And she has an impeccable memory. Like she remembers things that I can't remember, but she'll remember the smells we did when I was like 4 years of age. And Scott, I don't remember that. But she'll tell me, do you remember we had sardines? And I'm thinking, no, I don't. But the smell game is really fun and it's simple, but it also is helpful. And on the flip side, if you're dealing with a loved one in a nursing home and they're in the early stages of Alzheimer's or dementia, and you ask them to smell something, start with lemon, start with orange, something light, very simple, and ask if they like it. It's a great conversational piece because sometimes in the later stages of Alzheimer's or dementia, they don't recognize you. They're in a different state. And I know you know that, Scott. So this is a conversation that when you go visit, it's something now you can talk about, which I think is really important because it becomes, they may not know who you were or who you are, but maybe this is something that you can talk about in that moment, which is just 15 minutes, which makes you feel better and also feels them better, which then helps to deal with this isolation epidemic that the world is facing.
Great advice, Tracy. Thank you. And I'm sure the listeners will appreciate that because that's not an easy thing to go through. So, Tracy, thank you so much. It was
my pleasure.
First, great meeting you a few months ago at the Bond event. And anybody who's listening ever sees Tracy and she's going to give a speech or a seminar anywhere, definitely go see it. You will not be disappointed.
Thank you. I want to tell the listeners on that is I'm doing a fantastic exhibit at the International Design Show in Toronto, and it is on January 17th to the 21st. I'm part of an architectural group, so there's a variety of different individuals who are part of this. And the whole thing is on sustainability. Now, how do I get involved with sustainability? I am creating the smell of earth, or what would smell if we're going to have all these stuff. And Scott, you and I were talking about the sustainability of having the materials eventually go to a landfill. What would that smell like? So this is just an example. It's a fun example. It's a really great show. It's open to the public. It's also open to the design industry. It presents all kinds of obviously interesting things. I do webinars quite frequently for those of you who are not in my area. And we talk a lot about smell in various different areas. So I just want to say thank you again for the opportunity to be on your podcast. I think it's fantastic what you're doing. I thought it was great when you said you wanted to kind of liven things up and do things differently. And as long as we keep pushing ourselves, I think we're eventually going to get wherever we want to go.
Well, you definitely liven things up today, Tracy, and I appreciate it. I will definitely tell my friends and colleagues in Toronto about your sustainability event. And before we close out, to put you on the spot,
oh yes,
give me some of your favorite bands or favorite songs.
You know, when I was thinking, oh yeah, because you talked about this, and I thought, oh no, I can't. remember, but then I did. I thought I really love Aerosmith. I've always loved Aerosmith, and one of my favorite songs is "Sweet Emotion." I get really. I'll play the air guitar on that one. Everyone will think I'm crazy, especially my kids. And I love Diana Krall. It's her voice. I just fell in love with her voice. years and years and years ago. And I don't know what that woman sings. I think my favorite song would be Just the Way You Are. And then recently I've been listening to Miley Cyrus, which I never thought I would, but and the reason is because I don't really listen to the radio a lot. I listen to podcasts, and I have, the Spotify and all that great stuff. But anyway, I got into Flowers and her song Flowers, and I can play that 10, 20 times a day. I just think it's a fantastic song. It's lots of fun. And like Smells, it's a variety, right? Like really, Diane Krall, Aerosmith, and Miley Cyrus. So that kind of tells you who I am.
And that's a great tie-in to end on. Tracy, I appreciate your time today, and I'm sure the listeners are going to benefit hugely from it. Thank you.
Thanks again. I really appreciate it, Scott, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.
This concludes this episode, What If Scent Could Impact Design? Big thanks to Tracy Pepe for her insight into this interesting topic, and more so for educating me on an aspect of design that I had not really considered as heavily. As Tracy stated, she'll be speaking at the IDEA show in Toronto on January 18th through the 21st. And as I've seen her presentation previously, I would recommend any architects, engineers, and interior designers definitely check this out. For additional information pertaining to Tracy's website, ebook, and TED Talk, I'll be embedding all those links in my LinkedIn, Twitter, and podcast hosting posts. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Where Do We Go From Here, and tell your friends to do the same. Also, keep the mail and feedback coming. So far, I've received enough viewer mail that I anticipate providing a quick mailbag episode soon to answer some of the interesting questions that I've received. For now, I wish you all Happy New Year, and I look forward to bringing you thought-provoking content throughout 2024.